I'm beginning to wonder whether anyone over at NaNoWriMo reads, because I'm not convinced they do. If you're even remotely connected to the books and writing community, then you're likely aware of National Novel Writing Month, also known as NaNoWriMo, also known as Nano, an organization that holds an annual challenge in which writers strive to write a 50,000-word novel in the month of November. You're likely also aware of the scandal they brought upon themselves in September when they released a statement regarding their support of using generative AI. Prior to the release of the statement, many writers within the Nano community expressed concern about the potential use of AI during the challenge because AI essentially cannibalizes writers' stolen work in order to learn. After fielding all of these concerns, NaNoWriMo, who's sponsored by an AI company called Pro Writing Aid, made their stance known. Essentially, categorically condemning AI has classist and ableist undertones. Their original statement has since been edited, but thanks to the magic of the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, I did find the original statement, and I think we need to read parts of it to fully grasp just how wild it is. We believe that to categorically condemn AI would be to ignore classist and ableist issues surrounding the use of the technology, and that questions around the use of AI tie to questions around privilege. Bullet point 1, classism. Not all writers have the financial ability to hire humans to help at certain phases of their writing. For some writers, the decision to use AI is a practical, not an ideological one. The financial ability to engage a human for feedback and review assumes a level of privilege that not all community members possess. Bullet point 2, ableism. Not all brains have the same abilities, and not all writers function at the same level of education or proficiency in the language in which they're writing. Some brains and ability levels require outside help or accommodations to achieve certain goals. The notion that all writers should be able to perform certain functions independently is a position that we disagree with wholeheartedly. There is a wealth of reasons why individuals can't see the issues in their writing without help. They really thought they did something there. This appalled people for several reasons, the first of which is that there is no apparent concern for the very real issues surrounding the use of AI and how it takes in real writers' actual work. Second, Nano is essentially shaming people who have valid critiques of AI by calling them classist and ableist. Third, and most importantly, Nano is implying pretty strongly that low-income and disabled writers are simply unable to write or edit without the help of AI. They seem to be entirely unaware of the fact that that statement itself is classist and ableist. It's actually kind of wild to me that the employees who wrote this over at Nano seem to think disabled writers were invented in 2023. This is most certainly not the case. Disabled writers have been writing for as long as writing itself has existed. Now, it is true that for most of history, disabled writers were not afforded the opportunity to write and publish their work, or to even become literate in the first place, and publishing today is by no means an even playing field in this respect. But writers who did have the opportunity to write and publish found ways of getting their work out there. That's why today I want to highlight some disabled writers throughout history, none of whom used AI. Some of these writers you may know, some you might not, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. I also did not include any living contemporary writers, just to really hammer home the fact that AI is not necessary. Only one on this list lived to even see generative AI, and most of them did not even see the internet. So it's a relatively short list, but it is long enough to prove that disabled writers have always been here, and they have been essential in forming literature as we know it today. So we're going to go in chronological order, starting in the 14th century with Margery Kempe. Born in approximately 1373 in Norfolk, England, Kempe was a Christian mystic who wrote by dictation the first English autobiography. Aptly titled The Book of Margery Kempe, it documents her many pilgrimages to holy sites across Europe, as well as the details of her mystical communications with God. Because the visions and voices she experienced began after the birth of her first child, scholars suspect that she likely had a case of postpartum psychosis, especially because in her public displays of mysticism involved both expressions of mania and depression, often in quick succession. Margery Kempe exists in this sort of gray area because, of course, many centuries later, we can't truly diagnose her with anything. We can only speculate. Other scholars argue that we should let Kempe speak for herself and just take her at her word, that she is, in fact, communicating with the divine, rather than just immediately hitting her with a diagnosis. I respect that stance, and generally I would agree, but that means we also have to believe her when she herself questions her own sanity and wonders if she is out of her mind. Kempe wrote her book in third person, but these are her own words, and she writes, "Sometimes she was greatly depressed about her feelings, when she did not know how they should be understood for many days together, because of the dread that she had of deceptions and delusions, so that she thought she wished her head had been struck from her body until God of his goodness explained them to her mind." I find this passage really interesting because despite her devotion, she is open to the possibility that she might just be experiencing, to use her words, delusions, and have some form of mental illness, even if she didn't really have the language of mental illness at that time. As for the writing itself, it was very likely that Kempe was largely illiterate, so she employed first a scribe and then a priest to write her book, and she dictated it. Margery Kempe is truly a fascinating character, one that still doesn't quite get the recognition she deserves today, so I highly recommend you check out her book. No matter where you stand on whether or not we should diagnose historical figures with any sorts of disorders or illnesses, the fact of the matter is a woman and a mother in her 60s at the time of her dictation of the book, who likely did have some sort of neurodivergence or mental illness is responsible for the first English language autobiography, and I think that's pretty cool. Jumping forward in history about 200 or so years, we have John Milton, the Paradise Lost guy. I don't know what happened to the dust jacket, but just my big old Milton anthology. All of the poetry and the essential prose. Really heavy. I took a course on Milton in college. That's where this comes from. And prior to that, I had no idea that by the time he started writing Paradise Lost in 1658, he had been gradually losing his vision for about 20 years and had gone completely blind in 1652. No one is positive what exactly caused Milton's blindness, but scholars believe it was likely either glaucoma or detached retinas. Either way, he employed aides to transcribe his poetry. Around the time he lost his vision completely, Milton wrote his Sonnet 19, called When I Consider How My Light Is Spent, in which he mourns the loss of his eyesight and wonders how he's supposed to fulfill his God-given work as a writer if he can't see. Here are a few lines from the sonnet. When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent, to serve therewith my Maker, and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor, light denied. To really boil those lines down, of course they're more complicated than this, but he's asking, how does God expect me to do work that requires sight while he denies me sight? As we know, despite his grief over his blindness, Milton does continue his work as a writer and goes on to pen one of the most influential works of literature ever. Imagine if someone told Milton, sorry, bro, AI is your only writing option, but that's not going to come around for another 400 years, so it sucks to be you. Imagine how different the canon would look. If you haven't read Paradise Lost yet, you absolutely should because it is phenomenal. But I also recommend two other of his frequently recommended works, the poem Lycidas and the drama Samson Agonistes. For this next writer, I must admit I have not read any of his works yet, and it does haunt me every day just about, Fyodor Dostoevsky. I must also admit that prior to researching for this video, I didn't know he had epilepsy. According to documents written by doctors, observers, and Dostoevsky himself, he suffered from seizures for most, if not all, of his life, especially during his student years of 1838 to 43, and the 4 years he was sentenced to forced labor in Siberia for espousing socialist beliefs. Who would have thunk that extreme stress and forced labor would exacerbate seizures? An interesting fact I found while researching was that about a century later, one Sigmund Freud wrote an essay called Dostoevsky and Parricide, in which he asserts that Dostoevsky Dostoevsky was not truly epileptic, but rather that his seizures were caused by neurosis and severe hysteria. And that's actually the first time I've ever heard a man diagnosed with hysteria. I didn't know that was possible given the wandering womb nature of the diagnosis. I don't like Freud. I really don't like Freud. Thankfully, scholars and neurologists today have fought back against Freud and have retroactively diagnosed Dostoevsky with cryptogenic epilepsy, meaning epilepsy that has no clear cause. Seizures appear frequently in Dostoevsky's work, most notably in The Brothers Karamazov, in which the illegitimate son, Smerdyakov, suffers from seizures all of his life, kills his father, and then crafts alibis tied to several fake seizures. In The Idiot, protagonist Mishkin has epilepsy, and he experiences moments of transcendence during his seizures, which Dostoevsky did as well. In fact, there were times in Dostoevsky's life where he felt grateful for his disorder. He appreciated the abnormal tension it created in his brain, allowing him to feel, quote, unbounded joy and rapture, ecstatic devotion, and completest life. Thinking back to the nano statement from earlier, it strikes me that they seem to think that having a disability or a different brain can only be a hindrance to the creative process. But then looking at someone like Dostoevsky, Kempe, Milton, it's clearly not true. A writer recording these differences builds understanding and empathy between the people who experience them and people who don't. Literature would be a lot less interesting if we ran it all through a machine to cut the difference out. Going back to a writer I have read and admire very much, Flannery O'Connor. At the age of 15, O'Connor lost her father to lupus, and a decade later, after experiencing pain and fatigue in her limbs, she was diagnosed with the same illness. Except she didn't know she had lupus because her mother wouldn't tell her. For about a year or so, I believe, O'Connor believed she had a severe case of arthritis until a friend finally revealed the truth that it was lupus, for which O'Connor was grateful because she had expected it all along. I too would prefer not to be lied to about my health. The lupus itself, as well as the medication for it, restricted O'Connor's mobility considerably, so she walked with crutches and lived on a Georgia farm with her mother where she wrote every single day without fail. She also raised peacocks, which I just absolutely love as a fact, hence the peacocks on her book. By the time she died tragically young at the age of 39, O'Connor had written 2 novels and 32 short stories, as well as 1 incomplete novel that was published in January of 2024. Her work often explores themes of human immorality, physical violence, isolation, the grotesque, as well as spiritual transcendence, and there are recurring images of sick and disabled bodies. You may already be familiar with one of her more popular stories, A Good Country People, in which a prosthetic limb features prominently. If not, I'm going to tease you and say that the ending of this story is so shocking that I still think about it often, 10 years after reading the story for the first time. As with Dostoevsky, in discussing O'Connor, I'm once again struck by her taking the opportunity to explore her illness and her body and infusing that into great and influential works of literature. Once again, I'm equally struck by Nano's apparent ignorance of the impacts of disabled writers on literature. When I was writing my script, I kept flipping back and forth between my notes and their original statement, like thinking surely maybe we're just reading into it. But no, like it really does sound like they just don't believe disabled people can write without AI. Wild. Wild take. But real quick, if you're enjoying this video so far, do consider hitting that subscribe button. I'm Kelsey Jo, this is Thought Couture, where the life of the mind is down to earth, and I publish new videos just about every week on book recommendations, creative writing advice, and literary bookish commentary like this. Next up, we have Irish writer and painter Christy Brown. Brown was born with cerebral palsy, and though doctors recommended his parents institutionalize him, claiming he was mentally defective, they were determined to raise him at home. Brown's mother, Bridget, was particularly supportive, helping him learn to write, which he did by holding chalk in his left foot. because it was the limb he had the most control over. During Brown's adolescence, a social worker further encouraged him to pursue his literary and artistic interests, supporting him emotionally, financially, and educationally. Brown is best known for his autobiography called My Left Foot, which was published in 1954 when he was just 22. And yes, he did write it with his left foot, as well as with the help of his siblings who transcribed certain sections. The book was an instant hit, and it brought Brown international recognition. It was also adapted into a film in 1989 starring Daniel Day-Lewis as Brown. Although My Left Foot was by far his most popular work, Brown also wrote several other novels and poetry collections. In fact, Brown would later come to regret My Left Foot because it received far more acclaim as a miracle story than what he considered his more serious work. As mentioned, Brown was a painter as well, and though he admitted he didn't have as much talent or interest for art as he did writing, he was among the first members of what's called the Stegman Disabled Artists Association, who paid him to paint a set number of paintings every month. Though Brown is one of the most obscure writers on this list, the success of My Left Foot shows the first inklings of mainstream interest in nonfiction disability narratives. As you'll see, from here on out, it becomes considerably more common for disabled writers to either reach the mainstream or at least receive more widespread attention than in previous decades and centuries. Interestingly, although perhaps unfortunately, although Brown himself acknowledged that My Left Foot does kind of fall into, I guess, what we would now call the inspiration corn category, often that is where mainstream acceptance and humanization of marginalized groups starts, whether we like it or not. And I am sure that the autobiography had at least some effect on the writers and the policy change we're going to talk about in a minute. So it's finally time to talk about the writer who was my introduction to disability in literature and disability studies, Nancy Mairs. I discovered Mairs in college because at the time I wrote a lot about women's mental and physical health, and one of my professors was, or is, a fairly prominent disability studies scholar, and she thought I would like Mairs' work. She was correct, and now I'm recommending her to you. Mairs was an American writer of primarily essays and memoir who was diagnosed with MS in her late 20s. As the disease progressed, her mobility was increasingly restricted, and she used a wheelchair for most of her life. As such, disability and the body in general, as well as the experience of becoming disabled specifically, are the most common themes in Mairs' work, as well as issues surrounding womanhood, sexuality, and spirituality. What's especially notable about Mairs' work is her position on the language of disability. Mairs was strongly against inclusive language, terms like differently abled or even handicapped, because she thought they put way too much distance between language and lived experience. In fact, she preferred the term crippled because she thought that most accurately reflected the experience of being disabled and in pain. In one of her most read essays called On Being a Cripple, in this essay collection, Plain Text, she writes, "Cripple seems to me a clean word, straightforward and precise. It has an honorable history, having made its first appearance in the Lindisfarne Gospel in the 10th century. As a lover of words, I like the accuracy with which it describes my condition. I have lost the full use of my limbs. Disabled, by contrast, suggests any incapacity, physical or mental. And I certainly don't like handicapped, which implies that I have deliberately been put at a disadvantage by whom I can't imagine, my God is not a handicapper general, in order to equalize chances in the great race of life. But these words seem to be moving away from my condition, to be widening the gap between word and reality." Given the push for inclusive language in all sorts of areas today, Mairs' work can feel kind of uncomfortable, but what I love about her is that she's explicitly not interested in making people feel comfortable. In fact, she argues that if her language makes you uncomfortable, then that's all the more reason to read it, especially because disability is the only marginalized identity that any one of us can find themselves in unexpectedly at any time. I don't think I've ever seen Mairs mentioned or recommended in the online bookish space, ever that I can remember, which is a shame because I think her work deserves so much more attention. I own a few of her most often recommended and read books. First, the essay collection Plain Text, which includes the essay I just read from. The second collection, Carnal Acts, which should be enticing by the cover and title alone. Finally, Voice Lessons on Becoming a Woman Writer, which is part memoir, part sort of guide on exactly what the title says. Moving on to Octavia E. Butler. Considered the mother of Afrofuturism, Butler won 2 Nebula Awards and 2 Hugo Awards, and was the first science fiction writer to win the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. She was also dyslexic. Butler's dyslexia went undiagnosed for much of her childhood, and as a result, she didn't do very well in school, despite her love of stories, both listening to them and creating her own. In fact, her teachers accused her of copying the stories she wrote because they were just so imaginative that they couldn't possibly believe that she wrote them by herself. Finally, at 13, Butler had a teacher who recognized her creative writing talent and encouraged her to submit a story to a science fiction magazine. The story became her first published work, and it solidified her belief that she could be a professional writer. Butler would meet another supportive mentor several years later when she took a class with Harlan Ellison at the Screenwriters Guild of America. He encouraged her to attend the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, one of the oldest and most acclaimed sci-fi workshops in the US. By the end of the workshop, she sold her first 2 stories and then published her first novel, Pattern Master, in 1976. Like many other writers on this list, Butler incorporated themes of disability and difference into her work. Most notably, in Kindred, the character Carrie is deaf and nonverbal, and the protagonist Lauren of Parable of the Sower has a fictional disorder called hyperempathy, meaning she physically feels the pain and joy of people around her. Finally, it can't be overstated the strides Butler made for Black readers and writers, both within science fiction and in literature as a whole. She did not believe that Black characters only deserved a place in science fiction when their race was relevant to the plot, which was the typical attitude towards race in sci-fi at that time. Therefore, her work centers Black characters, and she imagines futures where these characters are instrumental in creating and shaping their worlds. In a 1999 journal entry, Butler wrote, "I never bought into my invisibility or non-existence as a Black person. As a female and as an African American, I wrote myself into the world. I wrote myself into the present, the future, and the past." A final heartwarming note I learned while researching is that Butler once wrote a journal entry in which she lists everything she intends to accomplish as a writer, including to send young Black writers to the Clarion workshop. And then since 2007, Clarion has offered the Octavia E. Butler Memorial Scholarship, which grants full tuition to a writer of color. That's just a nice fact for your day. Finally, let's end on the mother of the disability rights movement, and the only person on this list who lived long enough to see ChatGPT, Judith Heumann. Technically speaking, Heumann was more of an activist than a writer, though she did publish 3 books, and there's no doubt that her activism and advocacy work opened up innumerable opportunities for writers working today. Born in Philadelphia to 2 German-Jewish immigrants, Heumann contracted polio when she was 18 months old and used a wheelchair for her whole life. Her parents were activists in their own right, fighting for years for Judith to be allowed to attend public school, from which she was barred because they considered her a fire hazard. Imagine calling a whole person a fire hazard. After graduating from Long Island University in 1969, Heumann was called a fire hazard for the second time in her life when the Board of Education denied her teaching license, claiming she could not safely get herself or her students out of the building in case of a fire. This must have been just like the go-to disability discrimination line. Like, oh, we just care so much about fire safety. We care so much about fire safety that we can't have you in your wheelchair anywhere nearby. Incredible. So she sued the Board of Education, and though the case was settled without a trial, she was granted her license and became the first person in a wheelchair to teach in New York City. Heumann received an outpouring of support from disabled people across the country, and it was her first big move in a lifetime of disability activism. Heumann did a lot of policy work, like a lot, so I very much encourage you to look more into her life and her work, but she's probably best known for her help in developing and implementing the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, of 1990. The ADA is a civil rights law prohibiting discrimination based on disability in areas like employment, transportation, and public accommodations. Heumann was a proponent of the social model of disability, which posits that disability is socially constructed and that we should be changing society in order to include disabled people rather than changing disabled people to fit into society. She stated, "Disability only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things we need to live our lives. Job opportunities or barrier-free buildings, for example. It is not a tragedy to me that I am living in a wheelchair." In February of 2020, Heumann's memoir, Being Human, was published, and it brought her work and her life into the mainstream public eye for the first time. Shortly thereafter, she was featured in a documentary called Crip Camp, which spread her story even further. Heumann passed just last year in 2023 at the age of 75. Looking back at this short yet wordy list of disabled writers who most definitely never used AI, I'm noticing two themes. The first will make me sound like a broken record, but it is important enough to repeat. Disabled writers have made considerable and integral contributions to literature for centuries. So much so that literature in the canon today could not exist without them. Consider for a moment just how many books, poems, even films and music and TV shows are inspired or at least influenced by Paradise Lost. The short answer is a ton. What would English language autobiography look like if Margery Kempe hadn't written her book? What would science fiction look like without Octavia Butler? Who knows? The second theme is community. Just about every writer on this list had some form of support or assistance that helped their work get out in the world. Kempe, Milton, and Brown had either employees or family members who transcribed their work. Brown and Butler had mentors who encouraged their talents. Even the somewhat more isolated writers like O'Connor, Dostoevsky, Mairs had family, editors, friends, spouses who helped facilitate a life where they had opportunities to write and publish. This community element is the glaring omission to me in Nano's statement. They seem to suggest that AI is the one and only option for writers who need assistance with writing, transcribing, editing, revision, proofreading, etc. Meanwhile, all of the rest of literary history shows us that this is not the case. It is 100% possible to find real human people who can help you revise and edit your work and give you feedback, even for free. In fact, given the magic and the wonders of the internet, it is probably easier than it has ever been. Now, yes, it may take some time and trial and error to find a group of people, whether that's in person or virtually, who you work well with and that, give you good feedback that you need, but it is entirely possible. NaNoWriMo, of all people, should know this, given that they used to have forums for this very purpose that had to be shut down last year for bad behavior from some members and a lack of moderation. All in all, I think this debacle revealed what NaNoWriMo truly values: money, and that they're willing to co-opt the language of diversity and inclusion to get it. If nothing else, at least their ignorance has opened up a space in which we can highlight the achievements of disabled writers, as well as discuss how much progress the writing world still needs to make. Well, that is it for me today. I have been talking for a very long time. I am curious to know, were you aware of this controversy? And NaNoWriMo, what are your thoughts? Have you read any of the writers I featured today? Do you have any recommendations of your own for disabled writers or literature that you think we would like? Reminder, you can follow me on Instagram, Goodreads, and Threads for fun bookish extras and more full-length book reviews. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you'll also enjoy this one. As always, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one.